Hello and welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video we're going to be working on the transition, the scenic break that forms the end of the scenic part of the layout and the entrance to the fiddle yard. And as you can see, I've done my best to try and conceal that and make it look as if the scenic part of the layout just keeps going. If you've not seen the previous video, I highly recommend you check that one out, as we build all of the bridge and brickwork and surrounding hillside to create the sort of foundations for what we're going to do in this video, which is the all-important details, trees, bushes, grass, figures and track infrastructure, as well as a little bit of additional weathering. So let's go back about 5 weeks to the end of the previous video, where I begin the detailing process for this section. I've removed the backboard from the bridge here so it's easier to work on once again, and now we're going to continue adding further details and other bits and pieces. So while I was shooting the previous video, it occurred to me that it would be nice to try and extend the illusion and just blend things in a little bit better and make it look a little bit more convincing, like the layout is actually going somewhere. And when I was shooting those running shots, it became very apparent, especially from this angle, that you could see through that section of the bridge off the edge of the baseboard. So after quite a bit of thought, I'm going to do two things. Number one, we're going to extend the ballast to about this location here. It's apparent looking underneath the bridge that you can see the ballast finish. You can see at the moment it's just stopping short about there. So we'll extend that, and I'm also going to build a small embankment only on the far side, which is going to help looking through that bridge. You're going to see something on the other side rather than just the edge of the table. I've also extended the cable troughing, and that now follows that small embankment. So we'll get this ballasted and also put some sculptor mould on that bit of hillside just there, and then do some basic scenery, just grass, maybe the odd bush or something like that. But I won't be going as far as trees because it is mostly going to be out of sight. That's the plan anyway. And with that finished, I can put the backboard back into position and then focus on the actual scenic side and add those trees and numerous other details. So as you can see, I've put some spare bits of ballast and ground cover down there. Obviously it's a very different colour as it's all just fresh right now. Once it's all dried, we'll go over it with the airbrush and blend it all into the existing ballast. So the next thing to do is glue it down, and the standard process for doing that, spray it with some isopropyl alcohol and then use an eyedropper, and just very carefully, being mindful of the points, apply a 50-50 mix of PVA glue and water. With that finished, I'll leave it for 24 hours to fully dry, and then we'll come back and use the airbrush to weather it. Just to speed things up a little bit, while the ballast was still wet, I've also applied the sculptor mould, and you can see where I've just blended it back into the bridge and the surrounding scenery, and that'll just give us a lovely base to paint and glue the ground cover and static grass to. So I'll leave all this for a few days to dry, and then we'll come back and get the airbrush out. Okay, so it's been a couple of days since I applied the glue and the ballast has now dried. I actually went over that with a little bit more ballast in a couple of places and extended it a little further just to make it a little bit nicer and blend a little bit better to the ballast that we have underneath the bridge. You can also see at the back there I've laid the remainder of the cable troughing. It runs up the line until it meets the cable troughing that I had laid previously, just about there. So that'll look quite nice with all the lids, and I can add a couple of relay boxes along there as well, just to create a little bit more interest. I've also done some more ballasting over in this location. You can see I've ballasted some of the bridge girders into position. I've done a little bit of ballasting to the girder that's just behind this tree. It's very difficult to see the bits of ballast that were missing in that location, but if you looked from the right angle it was certainly noticeable. So I've tidied that up and those middle girders are now firmly in position. Once I get to building the tunnel portal and associated structure on the far side just there, we'll also reinstate the remaining bridge girder. The cable troughing now runs all the way down to connect to the piece that I laid previously underneath the bridge, and you can see I just had to dig up a small bit of the scenery just there and let the ballast in and just blend things in. So I'll get the airbrush out now and we'll weather all of this just so it blends in to the rest of the track work, and then we can carry on adding more detail. Okay, so as you can see, I've masked up any of the previously weathered areas of ballast, and that's just so that when I spray the fresh stuff to try and get the intensity of the weathering into it, I don't double the intensity on some of the neighbouring sections. I'll peel the masking tape back after I've done the majority of the spraying, and then we can just do a little bit of blending in. Today I'm using Railmatch Sleeper Grime, but I've also used Railmatch frame dirt in the past as well, both in enamel and acrylic colours. Today I'm using acrylic and the Sleeper Grime colour, but don't be afraid to mix and match some of the weathering tones. So it's been about a week as I've left all of the paint and everything to dry, and I also had that sculpt mould embankment that needed to dry, and now we're drawing into the winter months. Sculpt mould can take up to a week to fully cure. So I've just left everything up here and just let it do its thing, and I'll come back and just tidied up a few loose ends and clean the track. So you can see the bridge girder is now nicely blended in. The cable troughing runs all the way across the back there, although it's difficult to see as it doesn't currently have its lids fitted. You can see I've got a bit of sculpt mould to touch up there, that's no problem, and all of the weathering and ballast has also dried over on the far side of the bridge, and the sculpt mould embankment has now cured, and that can be painted. And as you can see now, when you look underneath the bridge, the ballast continues right through, and we can also see that embankment continuing along, giving the effect that the scenery continues much further. So I went downstairs and let the paint dry, let all the fumes dissipate. That's now completely cured, and it's now ready for some ground cover, and we'll apply that in the usual manner as per the rest of the scenery in this area. The next thing is to add some scale point motors, which are made by Pico, these little ones here, and we're going to put those up against the points. They're not actual point motors, they won't work, but they are a model representation of what is out there in the real world, or at least a representation of one of the many styles of point motor that is in use on British railways. So I won't be sticking like glue to the prototype. There are all sorts of things to consider with track infrastructure, the company that installed it, the maintenance that was done, the region that it's in. That will dictate the style in which the equipment is installed, the type of equipment that is installed, and it's a real minefield, and you only really know exactly what was what by going to a specific location and photographing it. So what I'm going to do here is just a rough representation of some infrastructure, something a little bit generic, but it's going to look much better than just nothing at all. So the first thing I've done is just dug out a small amount of the ballast just alongside the sleepers either side of the bit that holds the two rails on the point together, and I'm going to cut some offcuts of sleepers and just extend these out a little bit. And in real life, this is what the point motor would be bolted to, so it's in a fixed position and can operate the point blades. So I'm just going to put a blob of rocket card glue in there, and then I've just cut a couple of spare sleepers off a scrap bit of track, and then we should be able to install those like so. And with those in position, I've put a little bit of super glue onto the point motor, and we'll just install it in that position there. I've painted these in a very light grey, which is typical to the sort of condition they're in when they're new, and then I've gone over that with the Tamiya dark grey wash and also applied a little bit of oil paint in the form of a wash also, just to give a bit of age and wear and tear to the point motor. I've also done the same thing for the point on the other side of the track. Next thing I'm going to do is have a look in my box of spares and see if I can come up with some wire. You can see those two outlets on the point motor there, so there'll be two cables running off to the cable troughing. And I've found some very thin black wire, and that should do the trick, and we'll just glue those in various lengths in various areas to just add a little bit more detail. It's quite often not modelled, so I thought it'd be something nice to try and do. So I'm just using a bit of super glue, gluing the wires into position, and then I'll run those into the cable troughing and position the lids at a jaunty angle accordingly. There are no real hard and fast rules with some of the cable management when it comes to railway infrastructure. As things are added and removed, you can end up with some real sort of slapdash engineering work. And certainly if you look at these pictures that I took of the Midland Main Line about 10 years ago, you can see that there's loose lids and cables draped all over the place, and some of it not even run in any form of troughing or conduit, just lying loose on the ballast. So anything goes, and the more you do, the better it's going to look, the more sort of interesting the whole section will appear. For the point motor over on this side, I've routed the cables underneath the track as per real life and run them through some orange tubing as per the real thing. During the 80s, 90s and 2000s, it was common to see these orange plastic tubes routing cables underneath the track, although on the current scene these are no longer allowed. In this case, it's just some orange plastic rod, and you can buy that from Scale Model Scenery, and then I've just used the same very thin black wire to connect everything up and give the illusion that the cables run right the way underneath the track. A nice piece of detail that really helps highlight some of this infrastructure detail. It's just important to remember, if you're modelling the current scene, Network Rail no longer allows the use of this orange tubing. To fit the tubes, I dug up the ballast in a similar manner to how you've seen previously, using a screwdriver and a sharp knife, and then you can see I've just touched in with some fresh ballast there and glued it down with some watered down PVA glue. Depending on the effect you're going for, you could leave that as is, as it would look like a newly installed piece of infrastructure, and that's very commonly seen all over the network. Or if you want to, you can perhaps blend this back in with the airbrush and make it look as though it's been there for some considerable time. And that's probably the route I shall go down in this particular situation, as if it was a fresh install, I very much doubt the crew would have just shoved the cables in the cable troughing like that. But for something that's been added to and maintained over the years, something like that, a bit of a bodge. So the next thing to do is to fit some relay boxes, which will provide the necessary line-side equipment to receive signals from the signalling centre and then activate those point motors. Relay boxes, or as I found out the other day, location cases, to use their proper term, are located all over the country in numerous styles and numbers in various places along the line side. So it's always nice to put some of these along the edge of a model, as it just makes it look a little bit more real. These particular ones are 3D printed, resin 3D printed, and they're made by Model Railway Scenes. I thought I'd use a slightly different style for this end of the layout, as in the past I've pretty much exclusively stuck to the Pico/Wills versions of the relay boxes, and those are a little bit larger. I've put these in a scale model scenery kit. It's one of those little sort of support walkway things that you see along the line side when there's hilly terrain. You can see I've glued some more of that cable to the bottom of this platform, and once installed we can route that into the cable troughing, similar to how we've done with the point motors. Okay, so I've just glued that into position with some rocket card glue, replaced two of the lids back into position, and I'm just going to leave that all to dry with a weight sitting on the back railing just there to make sure the platform sits level as the glue cures. While that dries, I'm just going to work on a little bit of an entrance onto the platform. That probably wouldn't pass health and safety even back in the 80s, so I'm just going to put a concrete sort of board across a bit of the grass just there, and then backfill that with some ballast until it's level, and then it will look like some attempt has been made to make some sort of level access onto the platform for the relay boxes. There you go, nice and simple, just a concrete board, a little bit of scatter and some ballast. I've soaked it with glue, let it dry, clean off the excess, do a bit of weathering and everything once it's all cured. So over on this side of the bridge, I think it looked quite good if we put some sort of a fence along the side of the road, and I've got one of these scale model scenery kits. They make various fences, and I thought this one looked sort of quite appropriate for the sort of rural scene that we're trying to do. And then I've just airbrushed that with some of the Vallejo black brown, which is one of my favourite colours. So I'll put this along the edge of the track, and it just sort of discourage trespassing. It's the sort of thing that the farmer or the real railway or whoever owns the land would have done. There's certainly a track local to me where the fence runs along like this before it gets to a railway overbridge in the distance. So we'll drill some holes and glue that into position, and once that's installed we can come back and we can start actually adding some of those trees and bushes to this embankment and really sort of get some dense scenery going on. As you can see, I've left quite a lot of the ground devoid of static grass. There's not a lot of static grass, and that's because I intend on planting lots of trees and bushes that you would see on an embankment like this. So I'm just going to use some of the Jarvis dirt texture just to touch up where the posts go into the ground, and we can also use that as a means of securing them. So I'll put some of the scatter around the posts where I've drilled the holes, soak that with some glue, and then that'll dry nice and solid and the fence will be very secure. So I'll leave that to dry. You can see the slightly rickety nature of the fence adds to the sort of countryside scene. Don't lay everything absolutely pin straight and at 90 degrees from each other. In reality, these fences get really beaten up and abused and repaired over the years, and at times they're often many decades old. So if I was to lay this absolutely straight, it probably would have looked a little bit too perfect and uniform. So you can see there, it's clearly got some age to it, but it's still standing. So as you can see, I've extended the fence onto the far side of the farm track, and you can see this time the fence follows the edge of the track itself rather than sticking to the edge of the embankment or the railway line. Just thought we'd try two different effects on either side. So on this side it follows the top of the embankment, on that side it follows the road. So now it's time for some trees and bushes, and I've prepared a number of them ready to be installed in this section, and we're going to start over on this part of the embankment here. This is the area that we really want to look quite dense and built up with various shrubs and trees, so that we can sort of obscure the fact that the road is in fact disappearing into a flat back scene. As you can see, I've prepared a number of trees. These are made of seafoam, the Gauge Master seafoam to be specific, which you can buy in a sort of box. It comes with all sorts of bits of seafoam in there. Some of them are really good for trees, some of them not so much, so I tend to cut those ones up and use them for the sort of small shrubs, which are very important. For every tree you need a couple of shrubs and bushes. So I've scattered a lot of scenic materials over those with some wet glue. I've shown that in a couple of previous videos and then left them all to dry. So here you can see some established on the layout, and I've just basically done exactly the same thing with the Gauge Master seafoam, and I've used a couple of different tones of the various scatter materials so that we've got some trees that perhaps look a little bit more of an olive green and then some which are a little bit more of a bright green. When you purchase seafoam, you'll find that a lot of them are quite bent in appearance. A good example of a bent one is just there, which I need to straighten out, so you can see how the top of that tree really curves away. And whilst many trees do have bends to them and they're not perfectly straight, it is a little bit extreme with the seafoam, and I've tried various methods to straighten them out over the years. Everything from soaking them in PVA glue and hanging them with a weight underneath overnight to sort of try and straighten them out, to actually putting them in a pan and boiling them with some water. I've had limited success, and for really troublesome ones, what I still tend to do is tie a very small piece of brass rod to the tree trunk, which you can just see there. You see that little bit of wire on the base of the trunk, and then that straight piece of brass rod runs all the way up the tree and does a lovely job of holding it straight. So I'll go ahead and start to place those onto the scenery over here. I'm certainly going to need some more of the bushes and shrubs, the smaller pieces, but we'll certainly get a beginning over there. We can certainly get a good idea of how it's going to look, and then if I need to make any more, we'll extend that to the other parts of the scenery. I'll also be making sure that this bit at the back here, there's also a number of trees on it, nice and overgrown, so again it sort of hides the transition between the layout and the back scene. Okay, so as you just saw, we've added all of the trees and shrubs. Took quite a while to make all of those. I've made them in 3 batches. It does take a little while for them all to dry and to get them all ready and everything. So that took a couple of days. Just be patient, take your time, take the seafoam, paint it if you desire. I just sort of spray it with like a burn tumbler just to give it a sort of a bit more of a brown look to the branches. Spray that with some PVA glue. Cover that in some scatter, soak that further in PVA glue, and then just leave them all standing to dry for a couple of days, and then they can be placed onto the layout. I also added some bushes and some static grass to that fake embankment that runs behind the scenic part of the layout, behind this backboard which I've just reinstated. And although it was quite a lot of work and quite a lot of hassle, just for that small piece there to be shown as green shrubs and grass and the ballast to continue past the bridge, it just makes all the difference versus, say, the scene we ended up with in the previous video. I've also installed some more of those scale model scenery fence posts, and I'll add the wire at a later date when I feel brave enough. It's not a particularly enjoyable job. None of these trees are glued into position, they just simply pull out of the small holes that I've punched into the scenery, and it just makes things, you know, a little bit easier to work with regards to adding scenery in the future. You don't want to keep leaning over the trees and damaging them, and if they get dusty or anything like that, you can, you know, take them off and try and deal with them separately on the bench. So none of the trees and shrubs are glued down. And you can see how that fence meets up with the previous one, which runs along the edge of the railway line just there, making a border to this field. The plan with this field eventually is to just do a few tufts of grass and things like that, nothing major. I really like the open simplicity of it, being able to just look across onto the railway line just there. So I'll put a dog walking path following the edge of the fence, but it's not going to be crops or anything like that. You'd argue it's too small anyway. So there's still a fair bit to do, but I'm really pleased with how this is starting to look now. That's the sort of scenic break I was looking for. Something that hides the transition into the fiddle yard, but isn't your sort of typical tunnel or road bridge with a bus on it, that type of thing. So I'm pleased with that. So it's been several days since the last few clips, and I've done some more work on the scene, and we're starting to add those nice little details now, little bits and pieces that just bring some of the scenery to life. So on the muddy track we've got a British Rail Land Rover, which is one of the Oxford die-cast models, and a Bachmann figure, and I've just repainted him so he looks a little bit more in keeping with the period, so he's not quite so high vis. Back in the BR days they tended to just go with an orange jacket with an intercity arrow on the back of it, and that was about all you had. So you can see he's peering over the fence, wondering how on earth he's supposed to get down there. And you can see his mate is already down here getting ready to do some maintenance. So we've got a nice little scene there with the 2 figures, and the orange clothing just breaks up the otherwise very green sort of natural scene that we have here. Over by the field I've added the wire detail to the fence. I've been putting this off for a long time, but I decided to get on with it and do it, as it really does improve the look of the scenery. You can also see we've got 2 different types of fence there. We've got a sort of Great Western style fence on the right, and your more typical standard fence on the left. So perhaps they're of different ages or they were built at different times, but it just adds another little piece of interest and breaks up the uniformity of the scene. As I've said previously, this is a scale model scenery kit. It comes with some wire to use for the wire detail on the fence, but I find it can have a few kinks and marks in it, and it's very, very shiny in appearance. So what I've used instead is some grey cotton, and I think it just tones the fence down and makes it look a little bit more established. I've also got the airbrush out and gone over some of the scatter around the edge of the field with some of the Vallejo dark black-brown paint, and that just alludes to the fact that this is a bit of a footpath, and that it's trodden a few times a day by various dog walkers. Over at the very edge of the layout where the fascia board meets the scenery, I've added a little bit of the sculpt mould to help blend that in, and then I've just painted over that with the Vallejo black-brown paint again. We can then extend the scatter material to the very edge, and it will look as though there's a seamless joint. Over on this side I've added yet more sculpt mould to the bare bit of plywood that was to the right hand side of that lane, and that's the final bit that needs a little bit of grass, trees and bushes. And I've also added some sculpt mould at the very end there where the bridge begins and it slopes down to meet the retaining wall, as you would expect. Once this is all dried, I'll push the backboard back and just peel that bit of masking tape off, and we can finish the last piece. I've also glued the final bridge girder in position, and we're starting to have a think about how to continue the scenery down into this area of semi-detached houses. So the next job, going to add some ground cover up on the edge of the field just there to blend everything back in so it looks a little bit more like the rest of this ground cover, and then I'll go over that with some static grass, various lengths, colours and densities, just to create a little bit of a sort of field, a fallow field. It's just been left to just grow naturally, so we'll have various types of grass in there, and then we'll add a couple of figures, I think, walking around the perimeter, and it will just add another little bit of colour to break up the otherwise very green scenery that we have in this section. That will also allow me to maintain this relatively flat section, which is really good for looking out across the field onto the trains that are going past. If I was to put trees and whatever in here, buildings or what have you, I think it would somewhat take away from the rest of the scenery that we've already created. So we're just going to keep it simple here. It's great to just look out, watch the trains thunder past, and it's also very handy for filming. So that's the field looking quite a little bit better. We're still not finished yet, a few more details to add, but hopefully you can see the effect there of the patchy tones of the grass with the different colours. Just in my opinion looks a lot better than just putting the same colour down on a large section of glued surface. I like to do the spotting method, put lots of little blobs of glue all over the place and then do that in several stages, applying a different colour of grass each time. And you can see there how you get a bit more of a natural look and some of that soil still shows through. Once again, I'm using the model scene grass. All of the grass on that field is the 4.5mm length variety, and I used the summer, late summer and the beige blends. So I'm going to do a little bit more to this area, a little bit too green for my liking. Being such an open area during late summer, there would be a little bit more of the sort of burnt beige sort of grass, the dead sort of looking stuff. So I'm going to go over it again with a few spots and just add some of that. I've added another piece of fence to the far side of that farm track, and you can see the ground cover and a little bit of static grass is also in place on this side of the embankment. While that was drying, I've prepared another batch of trees and bushes, and they'll be installed on that section just to help obscure the back scene a little bit and give a little bit of raised detail over the back of that sort of road, as it's relatively flat at the moment. On the far side of the bridge, almost out of sight, I've added the coping stones to the top of the retaining wall and that final bit of brick detail. You can see it still looks a little bit fresh at the moment, so I'll be sure to go over that with weathering powder and just tone it down slightly. But that just fills in a small bit of detail that you might see when looking from certain angles at the bridge. So that's the grass pretty much complete. I'm just going to add a few tiny little bits of texture just to break up the grass a little bit, so we'll have some evidence of some small shrubs and bushes trying to grow out of the sort of tufty grass that we've got here. I've added a couple of small little pieces like that bit over there, and now I'll just add a couple of smaller pieces just to complement a few bits, and that will pretty much do for the field. I want to try and keep it relatively simple and just look out across it to the trains in the background. And to do that, I'm going to use some of the coarse turf from Woodland Scenics, specifically the burnt grass. I particularly like this sort of colour as it's not too vibrant in terms of the green, it's a little bit more subtle, and we'll just put a few clumps of that with some PVA glue in amongst the tufts of grass just to show a few small bushes and plants and things like that. So there we go, just a few spots like that. I also went over the top of that with some of the earth blend, and it's very difficult to see on camera, but it's just a couple of lighter greens and some reds and oranges, just to allude to some very small plants or flowers or whatever you want. And it just brings out a little bit of variation in the texture of the field rather than it just being completely grass. So although it's not 100% finished yet, I think I'll leave it there. Very pleased with the progress and how things are looking in this area now, and it's really nice to have some scenery running from the very back of the layout all the way to the very front, and for it to all be nicely integrated into the baseboard. That's the first real bit on the layout that has full scenery front to back, so I'm really pleased to have reached that milestone. It has taken a very long time to put this all together, mostly drying time with regards to glues and paints and plasters and things like that. Obviously it all has to be done in stages, and you can be waiting several days for a particular item to dry before you can really move on to the next stage. So it has taken about a month or more to put this video together, but certainly worth the effort, certainly worth the time. Really pleased with how that's looking. Still a few more small details to add to the bridge, but nothing major. And once again, I'm also very pleased I took the time to make that embankment continue through into the fiddle yard side of the layout, and from where we're sitting now, you wouldn't know. It looks like the landscape has continued all the way through, and that back scene integrates sort of nicely into the level of the roadway just there, and it all just sort of works and hides everything. So there you go, hope you enjoyed it. I'll leave you with a few running shots, and of course I'll be back as soon as I can when I've made enough progress to produce another video.